Okay, in the second emotions video, we're going to talk about interpreting and labeling emotions. And so, a key theory having to do with labeling emotions is cognitive arousal theory. And so, this is going to get at um, how there are just kind of there's a missing piece seemingly in just having the James Lang theory, that it's all about arousal and that it's all on these discrete emotions just evolving to form certain functions. Because there is, when just looking at physiological arousal, there is some ambiguity consistently about still about what the emotion is. So that provides evidence that there is a missing piece and that physiological arousal does not account for anything when determining emotions. And so, based on cognitive arousal theory, that missing piece is a cognitive interpretation. So the idea is that to distinguish and be able to interpret and label emotions, not only do you need to know the physiological arousal levels, but you also need to know, you also need to have, if you're the person feeling the emotion, you need to have a cognitive interpretation based on the context of whatever is going on around you. And if you're interpreting, the emotion of another person, you also need to know what's going on situationally. And so, just happiness as an example of an emotion that's, again, a positive emotion that's typically going to be associated with increased levels of arousal. But then, based on this theory, really be able to classify that as happiness, or, yeah, as happiness, you're also going to need to know that situational context. An example of that could be, okay, my arousal is higher and my friend just told a joke. And so, therefore, with that arousal cue and knowing the contextual and having that contextual interpretation, I now know that the emotion is happiness. And so, interestingly, with this cognitive interpretation piece, there can be misleading context. And so, this can be used in multiple scenarios where um, context can be used to change interpretations of arousal and to change what individuals think an emotion is stemming from. And so this is an example of that. The concept that's going to be talked about in this slide is excitation transfer. And so um, basically, they did a study where they interviewed people either after the Capilano Bridge, which is this one here. It's in Vancouver. It's very long and very high up, so it's arousing to walk across it because it's also just a suspension bridge is pretty. I haven't done it, but it seems like it'd be pretty arousing and a bit scary. And so in the study, they interviewed people after crossing this bridge or after crossing a smaller bridge and manipulated experimenter attractiveness. And by manipulated in this case, I just mean that um, they had the person who was interviewing people after crossing these bridges be objectively attractive. And so what they measured was they gave participants contact numbers that they could call for future studies. And so here in this chart, you're going to be looking at male subjects or participants and whether the experimenter who was interviewing them was either female or male. And so as you can see, when the experimenter was especially when the experimenter was female, after the participants went across that scary bridge, the percent of calling to participate in the future study was much higher. And so then the question is, what is the source of that arousal, right? And so The idea with excitation transfer is that arousal from one area can be actually attributed to other things. So in this case, well, the source of the arousal was likely the scary bridge. It seems as though people misattribute that to be the attractive experimenter. And then again, arousal is oftentimes associated with more of those positive emotions. And so then that can lead to the participants calling more often. And so that would be a misattribution of this source of arousal, otherwise known as excitation transfer. And so this is what I think certain date ideas come from. So for an example, um, from this excitation transfer point of view, it might not be a bad idea to do something like watch a scary movie on a first date if you're trying to get a second date, because there's a chance, as we see in this study, that arousal stemming from that scary movie could be attributed to you as opposed to that scary movie. There's also this idea of embodiment. We're talking about emotion interpretation. And so this is the idea that recognizing and thinking about emotions involves the activation of muscles that are also involved in that emotion. So maybe better put, when trying to interpret what an emotion is, you also make that emotion yourself with your face, because that helps with that interpretation. And so, yes, we use our bodies as well as our brains to interpret various emotions. And so there's just a few areas I want to point out here. First of all, we have the zygomaticus, which is involved in kind of the lip curling that happens in smiling, as you see here. We also have the levator, which is here. This guy that's involved in the wrinkling of the nose that occurs during disgust. So you can see that here. There's the orbicularis, which is up here. It's right by the eyes. That creates what's called crow's feet, which happens oftentimes when smiling. And finally, there's the corrugator, which is this here. It's involved in eyebrows, crinkling the eyebrows, which you can see in anger, and you can actually also see in disgust here. This is just showing some research that supports the idea of embodiment. And so, again, the idea is that emotion increases facial muscle activity, and that we, again, will use those facial muscles to understand and interpret what the emotion is. So as you can see here with neutral, with the resting face, I guess it's basically just the levator. It's elevated a bit, but when you move into the emotion of happiness, the levels of the orbicularis, or I mean the activation, the movement of the orbicularis, as well as the zygomaticus increase. With anger, you get a lot of activation from that corrugator, as we saw in that last slide. And then finally, with disgust, you get activation again of the wrinkling of the nose, as well as those eyebrow movements, so corrugator and levator activation. Really interestingly, I think you can also kind of get the flip side of embodiment, or the reverse of that. So basically what happens with this is that if you block the ability to perform a facial expression, it impairs the ability to interpret what that facial expression is and to label information as evolving to one emotion or another. So in this study, for this chart here, one condition had to express these emotions, either neutral, disgust, happy, or angry, with a pen in their mouths. And so if you've ever tried that, If you haven't, maybe give it a try now. It's kind of a fun thing to do, but it can make making certain emotions like disgust and happiness pretty difficult, and also makes kind of just like the neutral resting face different. And so in this study, the next part that they did was they had participants do a word classification task where they had to separate certain words into these four categories, again, neutral, disgust, happy, or angry. And then what was measured was the accuracy of those classifications. And so, as you would expect, based on the reverse of this embodiment, people were, when they had the pen in the mouse and they weren't really able to make that disgust face, especially with the happy face as well, they were not nearly as good at accurately classifying words into the happiness and disgust categories. But for the emotion of anger, where you can still make the angry face while you have the pen in your mouth, there was no effect of having the pen in the mouth. So yeah, so that's it for emotion interpretation. We'll finish up this emotion and mood section by going into emotions and certain behaviors.